This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Ixalan, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. We're still in the early stages of Lost Caverns of Ixalan Limited, and as usual, after the first few weeks of the format, I like to do a retrospective on my set review and talk about 10 cards from the set that I was wrong about. My set reviews, of course, come out before I ever have a chance to play with the cards, as the goal is to get you ready for the pre-release and to have you as ready as possible when the format gets on Arena. But things, of course, end up not panning out the way one expects them to, both because of the particularities of a given format and because some cards are just hard to evaluate because we've never seen a card like them before. So let's start off with a card that I overrated, which is Dact Echo. I gave this a C+ in the set review. I thought 5 mana 3/2 draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. That's going to be a 2-for-1 a decent chunk of the time, and it'll even have flying sometimes. And I thought overall that would be a pretty reasonable deal, but it just turns out it isn't. It does get flying reasonably easy, but as we've seen over and over again in recent limited formats, having really efficient stats is increasingly becoming more of a problem. So even a card that gives you like 2-for-1 potential, the fact that this dies to so many smaller creatures, can't block them effectively, gets completely blown out by combat tricks, like all of that really matters. I do still think, I don't think of this format as a fast one still. I do think you need to be playing things early and you need to be prepared for going up against aggro decks, but slower strategies work, but you really still can't be playing a card like Dact Echo in a deck like that. You need something that, allows you to actually stabilize, gets you some real value on board more often than you need a card that's going to, be really inefficient and draw you a card. And, I gave it, like I said, a C+ in the set review. The win percentage over on 17 lands is 52.4%, which is really bad. So just a reminder how 17 lands works. You can check them out at 17lands.com. Sign up and have them track your limited data. So it has this huge database of limited players and where they've picked cards and how those cards have fared and all sorts of stuff like that. And it can tell us a lot about a limited format. It doesn't tell us everything, but it does tell us a lot. And one really interesting thing here is that blue is the best color in the format in terms of win rate. So this card may be even worse than it looks because it's being pulled up by the fact that the other blue, like there's a mountain of really good blue commons in this format, and this just isn't one of them. But its win rate is probably still being pulled up by how good blue is collectively. One thing to keep in mind, by the way, 52.4% might sound like, well, it's winning more often than it loses, right? And that's sort of true, but the thing to keep in mind is that the average win rate of 17 lands users is higher than, the general Magic population, which is going to be 50% no matter what you do, right? Somebody wins all games and somebody loses all games, so the collective win rate is always 50%. But on 17 lands, it's 55.5% because these are people who are very enfranchised, limited players who care about having their data tracked and all sorts of stuff like that. So they're going to be better than your average player. They're going to have a better win rate than your average player. So 52.4% is a lot worse than it sounds. It's more than 3% lower than the average win rate on 17 lands. And this card, gave it a C+ in the set review. It's more like a D. That's really how it's panned out. It just has not been a very good card for this format. It just ends up being too inefficient. Next, let's take a look at one of those really good blue commons, which is Oaken Siren. Gave this a C+ in the set review. It has a 58.3% win rate, which is really high for a common. So I liked this card. A C+ means you're basically going to play every copy of this card you get. It's going to be pretty good. I like that it was a pirate. I like that it was an artifact. And I like that it just had good stats as a 2-mana 1/2 flying vigilance and a set with a bunch of counters in it. I liked that it could help you ramp artifact stuff, but it turns out that all that combination of all of that is even better than I thought it would be, is basically how things have panned out. It is an incredibly good common. I mean, a 58.3% win rate for a common is, it's not unheard of, but it's really, really high for this card. It just does everything you want to do in blue. I guess it doesn't do graveyard stuff if you want to nitpick, but the fact that it's an artifact, the fact that it's a pirate, those things make it really good. And even if, you're doing graveyard stuff, you're still usually pretty happy playing this because it's going to have synergy with stuff you have going on in your deck. So I gave it that C+ in the set review, but it's more like a B. You know, it just is a very, very high quality common. You will play every copy of it you have in your deck, but you're going to be thrilled about doing it instead of just being like, yeah, this is solid. It's an actively good card. Let's look now at Itals Favor. I talked about this one a little bit last week because it was really clear from like the moment I played the format that this card was way better than I thought it was. I gave it a D+ in the set review, and my rationale for that was, sure, it lets you discover, but I just don't feel like you're getting enough more than a card when you play Itals Favor to really feel like you're getting, like, sometimes you'll feel like you're getting 3 mana back, right? Because you hit a 3-drop, but the times where you hit things that are cheaper, I just thought those were going to outweigh things enough, and that the base effect of Itals Favor was small enough that it just didn't feel like it would do enough. So, you know, that's why I gave it a D+ grade, which means you're going to cut it most of the time. But that's not true. You know, you can't run like 4 of these necessarily. Sometimes you can. But because it's not a creature and you need creatures to put it on, filling up a bunch of non-creature slots with it kind of can weaken the card because you need to have creatures to put it on, right? Unlike Oaken Siren, which is a creature. So, but still, like, I want like 2 of these in all my red decks. It ends up adding plenty to the board for the cost. A lot of the time it feels, you know, you get a buff that it matters right away because it makes your attack better than it was. I mean, giving trample to a huge creature comes up a reasonable amount of the time. You know, making an evasive creature hit harder, more effectively, you know, is going to allow it to attack a lot more effectively than it could before. So first, the aura has a bigger impact than I expected on more boards than I expected. And second, you end up discovering into real value a huge chunk of the time in this format. You know, there are times where you hit a 1-drop and it feels kind of meh, you know. But to some extent, you can make sure you're not running too many like insignificant 1-drops in your deck that aren't going to feel very good when you hit them with Itals Favor, because most of them aren't, you know, cards you should be playing anyway if they're that insignificant. But even hitting a 1-drop with this and getting like a, you know, the 1 mana 1/2 that gives -2/-0 to something, I mean, you're paying 3 for the +1/+1 trample boost and getting a 1/2 out of it. You know, it ends up being fine. That's not great, but that's like one of the bad scenarios when you play Itals Favor. And there are lots of scenarios where it has a way bigger impact than that. Its ability to add to the board shouldn't be understated, and the stats boost plays really well in this format in general. You know, whether you're in red-green and playing some big old dinos, or whether you're in blue-red and you're playing a bunch of flying pirates, like either way, you're going to be happy to play this most of the time. It's good in pretty much all the red decks. So yeah, it has a 57.9% win rate, and I think it's more like a C+. You know, it's not quite on the level of Oaken Siren in terms of how good of a common it is, but it is really, really good and certainly better than I expected it to be. Let's look at another card with Discover that has overperformed, and that is Zoeticglyph. Gave this a C+ in the set review, so like Oaken Siren, I thought it would be a quality card. You know, I compared it to Mightstone's animation from the Brothers' War, a card that animated in an artifact into a 4/4 and drew you a card when you cast it. I thought it wasn't going to be as good as Mightstone's animation, and the reason for that was that you didn't get the card up front. But just like in that format, it wasn't that hard to find things to animate. You know, you can animate a treasure or a map, or, you know, putting this on Oaken Siren, for example, is a pretty powerful play. Usually it's even better to animate something that wasn't already a creature, but there's just a lot of things you can do with it. And then the fact that the way it triggers is flexible enough, and by that what I mean is it doesn't matter if the creature dies. What matters is Zoeticglyph goes to the graveyard one way or another. But generally casting this puts your opponent in a horrible spot. You're like, look, I have a 5/4, which is relevant pretty much all game long, but especially if you're slamming this on turn 3 and can attack them with a token you already had in play. That's a real problem that's going to kill them quickly, and it's just like a lose-lose situation for them. Because sure, maybe they can deal with it, and, you know, sometimes they can bounce that token, right? Well, Zoeticglyph still goes to your graveyard and you still get to Discover. So, like, no matter how they deal with it, generally speaking, you're going to get that Discover trigger and you're going to get a 2-for-1. The one exception to this is maybe if they put Petrify on it, but even then, you can either sacrifice or craft away the thing you have it on later and get the Discover. So, it's pretty hard for your opponent to find a way for you not to Discover when you cast this. It just ends up being, you know, massively powerful. And really, it has like an insane win rate of 63.8%. That's better than almost every rare and mythic in the set. It's the best common or uncommon in the set right now, according to 17 Lands data. That's how good this is, and that's certainly not a C+. Instead, it's more like a B+ level uncommon, and honestly, it's not that far from being a bomb. This is a card, it's like a mythic uncommon, you know, in the sense that you first pick this every single time you see it, both because blue's a really strong color, and this is like incredibly powerful. It's really not very far from being a bomb. It almost always guarantees you get some value, and the floor of it is still like a really efficient buff on a creature, and it's pretty hard for your opponent to ever find a way to come out ahead against it. It's just been an excellent, excellent card. Much better than the C+ I thought it would be. Let's talk now about a mythic rare. You know, mostly I focus on commons and uncommons in this sort of list, but I do have two rares / one rare, one mythic I wanted to talk about. One of them is Talk Deepest Foundation. So I gave this a bomb grade, and I had it on my top 10 bombs list. It hasn't really panned out that way, and some people in the top 10 bombs video told me it wouldn't, and they were right. I thought it would be enough that this is a 6-mana, 6/6 vigilance that is relatively easy to bring back when your opponent kills it. And don't get me wrong, this card is pretty good, but it's not a bomb or really even close to it. Part of the problem is that even though it's recursive, paying 6 for this thing, and then your opponent, you know, can remove it or bounce it for very little mana, or even attack through it if they have some combat tricks, like all of those things feel pretty bad, even if you can get it back, because the tempo hit is so big, and that's often the kind of thing that can lead to you losing a game. And the fact it doesn't generally deliver a bunch of value to you, like no matter what you do, ends up making it not really work out as a bomb. Sure, you can get it back later, but it usually takes a few turns, it's expensive, so it's just not a bomb. You know, it ended up being a card with a 56.1% win rate, which that's only a little better than average, right? So it's more like a C+. You know, the triple tokens thing matters. The big problem is just paying so much mana for this and it not usually delivering any sort of immediate value that allows you to stabilize. There's too many ways your opponent still wins after you play this, and that keeps it from really being a bomb. And I think the win rate really reflects that. Let's go ahead and just talk about the other rare too, which is also a white rare, but I was wrong in the other direction. And that card is Warden of the Inner Sky. This is another one where people told me I was going to be wrong, and the people who told me I was going to be wrong were right. I gave it a C in the set review. It's a 1-mana 1/2. I knew there would be lots of ways to buff it, and there certainly are. There's lots of ways to put multiple artifacts into play. You know, Tinker's Tote is this thing's best friend, for example. But what I didn't like is that it would take a while, I thought, to really get it going in the later game, to make sure that it would remain relevant. You know, I also wasn't a huge fan of the sorcery speed restriction on all of these tap effects, and that certainly is a limitation. But overall, there's just so many board states where you just play this and buff it, sometimes twice in the later game, because you just have all these artifacts lying around. Like, blue-white decks are just going to have artifacts lying around to buff this. Same thing with red-white. It's just not very hard to do. And this thing ends up taking over a lot of games. You know, if you play it on turn 1 and you have like a nice curve out with cards that make multiple bodies, it's going to take over a lot of games. It's going to deliver a ton of value for the mana investment. And even in the later game, you can buff it quickly enough on a lot of stalled out boards to the point where it becomes the biggest threat on the board. So it has a 63.4% win rate, which you'll note is still lower than Zoeticglyph. So this is like a really good rare. Not as good as Zoeticglyph so far of how it's performed in the format, which doesn't really surprise me. I don't quite think it's a bomb. The Warden does take way too much work to really be a bomb, but it is a really high quality rare. You know, I gave it a C. It's more like a B+. You're going to first pick it most of the time when you see it, although I wouldn't take it over Zoeticglyph, for example. So, it's ended up being way better than I expected it to be. Let's talk about another card that is yet another one from the set review where many people in the comments told me I was wrong, and you were right, and that is Loadstone Needle. So this kind of card often just isn't very good. You use up a card, right? And you shut down a creature for a few turns. I was evaluating this compared to most versions of that we've seen. We saw a bunch of cards like that in blue-white in the last set, and they just really didn't pan out. And that's how they are most of the time. But Loadstone Needle is doing enough other stuff in this format that it has really overperformed. I gave it a D in the set review, which means you're not going to play it most of the time. I looked at it sort of as bad removal that didn't deliver enough value to be worth a full card. But like I said, there's a few things going on here to make it well worth what it costs. First, overall, I think the ability to freeze, to stun a creature down is better in this format than I expected. There are a lot of creatures that like explore and get bigger. People are putting auras on their creatures. You've got Zoeticglyph and things like that we've seen. People are putting counters on their creatures. A lot of board states in this format feel like they have like one beefy creature that is your main problem. And Loadstone Needle allowing you to negate that problem for a few turns has ended up being better than I expected. So that part has been good. It can also slow down any sort of early aggressive start your opponent has because it's cheap enough. Then the fact that it's an artifact delivers you some extra value. You can do all sorts of value things with it. For example, you put Zoeticglyph on it, right? So, it does a whole lot of stuff in this format that just give you some value. And then its transformed form, first, is really easy to get to. It's one of the cheaper ways to craft something. And what you get is better than I expected, too. It's interesting because I do love Explore, as a mechanic. And I was pretty excited about the other side of this card. I said that in the set review. I love the idea of being able to explore every turn for cheap. Like, that's just so much value, right? But I just didn't think the whole card would deliver enough for how much you're investing in it to really be worth playing most of the time. But obviously enough, it's panned out that it has, and then some. It has a 58.5% win rate. It's more like a B-. It's a card I find myself first picking and taking really highly in this format all the time. Let's look now at Ruin Lurker Bat. So this is another card I gave a C+ in the set review. Lots of C+s in the set review on this list. Some I was wrong about in terms of being better. Some I was wrong about in terms of being worse. And this is one that has been much better than I expected. Obviously, a C+ means I liked it a reasonable amount. 1 mana, 1/1, flying, lifelink is a decent enough starting point. I knew the format had ways to buff it that would make it better. And, tacking Scry 1 onto things on a lot of your turns by like the mid to late game seemed pretty good to me. But a few things. First, playing a 1-drop in this format, especially an evasive one, is just a super powerful play. It can really pull you really far ahead, especially because there's lots and lots of ways, more than I expected, to buff creatures. You can play the 2 mana 1/2 that puts a counter on it. You've got all kinds of auras and equipment that are worth playing in this format, some of which you have to craft into. But, turning Ruin Lurker Bat into a 2/2 on turn 2 is like a very common occurrence in the format, and it often gets larger and larger the longer the game goes on. And a flying lifelink creature, even if your opponent eventually deals with your 2 mana flying lifelink creature, the advantage that it has granted you by creating a huge gap in your life totals between you and your opponent is usually so much that your opponent really doesn't have much hope of catching back up. And that's something I'm saying about a 1-drop that is very easy to combine other cards with for value. The baseline's really good, and you end up scrying with this a ton too. All right, let's look now at a card that I overrated after all these cards I underrated, and that card is Acolyte of Aot. And it's kind of a stand-in for basically all the sacrifice stuff in the format. Every format kind of has something that doesn't pan out super well. You could say that about caves in this set. I think, even though you can sometimes make caves work, you kind of have to force it and hope it works out, which can be fun, but it's not something I advise if you're trying to win. I do have a cave draft video up on the channel, though, if you're interested. It was one that started with 4 auto picks, though, so I just sort of said, to heck with it, let's just draft this thing. And, it worked out okay. But the point is, Cave deck really hasn't worked out that well. Those aren't cards that I think I got that wrong, and that's why none of them are on this list, because I gave a lot of them build-around grades, and they are good when you can build around them, and not when you can't. It just turns out you can't very often. But the Sacrifice deck really also hasn't panned out, which early in the format I've probably still had the most success with Black-White, honestly, but I think it's mostly anecdotal based on all the evidence I'm seeing about how this, all these cards that do sacrifice things are much worse than you think. And Acolyte of Aot is sort of the worst of them, but basically all the Black-White cards that say sacrifice on them aren't doing that well in the format. And overall, that deck kind of hasn't panned out. So the Acolyte is a card that, it has a lot of problems that are sort of specific to the format. One of them is that just being a 1/4 is kind of a miserable stat line. Like, defensive stat lines, just, like, that one's just not very good. You know, it's a similar problem to the one we saw with Dact Echo, but I think this is even worse because at least Dact Echo has 3 power. You know, it can trade with things more effectively. But there's so many situations where your opponent just attacks with 2 things, and they have, like, 1 generic and a green up, you know, and you just can't block it. So the fact that this has a defensive body doesn't really matter because it can't block very effectively. The format also has a preponderance of cheap evasive creatures that it can't block. So the 1/4 stat line, 3 mana 1/4 stat line is not very good in this format to begin with. So that's the first part. Second of all, the whole you know, sacrifice theme, as I said, hasn't really panned out. It's generally better to find ways to get value out of your artifacts more than once, like per artifact, right? That's something like red-white can do by tapping artifacts. Sacking them sort of puts you in a spot where you're only getting 1 thing out of them, and that just isn't very good. And then on top of that, the Acolyte's trigger, the drain 1 life thing, also just not very significant. So I give this a C+ in the set review. I thought it would be an okay sack outlet. Hasn't been for all the reasons I just described. It has the lowest win rate of any card we're looking at of an impressive 48%. So very, very bad. And again, you know, you can look at the 3 mana 3/2 sacks an artifact when it enters, puts counters on things. That's worse than you think, as are all the other sacrifice payoffs. So this is definitely not a C+, and if it's anything, it's an F. So you really shouldn't be playing Acolyte of Aot. And if you have, like I have, sorry, you know, I can't be right about everything in the set review, but I'm telling you now, generally a good idea. Like, you can have a good black-white deck, but it's usually just got a bunch of good removal in it, and it's not really all in on sacrifice like Acolyte of Aot wants you to be. And then the last card I want to look at is the blue-white Signpost uncommon, Master's Guide Mural. So, in the set review, I thought this was the worst of the Signpost uncommons, basically. I gave it a C+, which is, again, still a pretty good grade, right? But it's turned out being better than I expected. You know, it's not an incredible card by any stretch. You know, a 5 mana 4/4 is what you get up front, right? And that's kind of brutal. You know, especially in a format with all these tricks, it's hard to effectively block with a 4/4 on a lot of boards. But it's not that hard to get the extra value out of this. You know, people who are saying the format is really fast, I mean, it kind of is. You have to be adding to the board anyway. You can't just chill and not do anything. But cards like Master's Guide Mural and Clay-Fired Bricks, I think both show you that you can make games go long in this format because both of those cards wouldn't be nearly as good, and they both have pretty good win rates, especially Clay-Fired Bricks. That's one I thought would be good. I didn't think as much about Master's Guide Mural. But, you know, you end up being able to craft this more often than I expected, and the turn you craft it, you get another 4/4, and this just turns into a factory, like, pretty often. And it's ended up having a 57.1% win rate. Like I said, that's not insane, but it's also not the worst Signpost uncommon. And it's a B-, and I don't think it quite gets all the way up to a B. It has problems in this format because you do need to be playing things that, you know, deliver some immediate value in a more effective way than this does, like the turn you play it. But most of the time, you're able to get the extra value out of it later, and it can take over games in a way that very few uncommons can if you do get to that point in the game. All right, so those are 10 cards I was wrong about in this format. Some of them I overrated, some of them I underrated. What cards do you think I was wrong about that I didn't talk about in this video? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on my drafts in this format or my other vlogs about the format, check out the end screen, which you'll see shortly, which will have playlists on it. Thanks for watching.